Hey, I'm Three Gnomes, I'm a solo indie game developer, and I've been working on a game called Too Much Quests, which is a party-based RPG with comedic elements, sort of inspired by D&D, where you can switch between party members at any point. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to where I was at the end of the last devlog. Okay, so clearly I've made some progress. The big question I had to ask was what is going to make a good combat system for this indie game that I'm working on? So thankfully, due to the nature of the type of game that I was making, I did have a concept already in mind for what I thought I wanted. But I'll also sort of break this down based on the thought process behind that as well. So the first question I had to ask when going into this was, what do I want the tone or the feeling for the player to be when they're going into combat? I knew I wanted it to be a little bit separate. And what I mean by that is that I wanted it to be separate from the typical exploration where you're actually going to be experiencing the combat in a different way. And that ties into that player experience that I wanted. So in broad strokes, I want the player to feel like they're playing a game similar to Dungeons & Dragons with a group of friends that they think are very fun. And so while I'm not necessarily trying to copy what Dungeons & Dragons does, I think a lot of RPGs of that style do sort of have this separate experience and mechanics for combat. And that's sort of what I'm going with here. And in some games, it's all sort of one. I mean, if you look at Marvel Rivals or Overwatch, that experience is all one experience. The combat is the gameplay. And then if you look at RPGs like Elder Scrolls or Fallout or even Cyberpunk, a lot of the experience is you're sort of exploring, you're doing quests, but then pretty much at any point you can stumble upon enemies and just naturally go into the flow state of combat. One minute you're walking around, the next minute you're shooting mole rats and boat flies, or cyber psychos, or whatever these things are. So I think one of the most obvious things for me was that I wanted it to actually look, when you go into the combat system, like you're in a room with your friends to play D&D, sitting at a table, looking down at sort of the setup. So I sort of started making the physical layout of that. And from there, it was figuring out what the mechanics were going to feel like. So I knew I wanted it to be cozy. I didn't want you to have to rush. I didn't want you to have to fear failure. And I wanted it to be simple and easy to play. Not easy in terms of, oh, it's not difficult, but easy in terms of you shouldn't have to stress about knowing what to do moment to moment. And that sort of leaned into turn-based combat for me, which also fits the D&D style. And unless you're doing it like XCOM where you set a timer, typically turn-based combat can be pretty cozy if you let it. However, I also wanted it to be strategic. I wanted you to have to think at least a little bit about what you're doing turn to turn. I didn't want there to be some optimal strategy where every turn you just hit the attack button. And then finally, because it's an RPG, I wanted it to feel like there was this sense of progression, where your stats would level up, you'd gain experience, and you'd gain new abilities as you went. And so if you look at D&D, a lot of it's just on paper. You have abilities, you have spells you write down, and you just do that. However, because I wanted this to be sort of representing as if you're playing this new board game with your friends, I had the freedom to create new fake systems within it that essentially this is replicating. And so rather than going with a typical RPG format, what I thought would be fun was to set it up with sort of a card battler system, which is a type of game that I enjoy a lot. So it's not necessarily a deck builder. It's more a way to visualize and conceptualize your abilities while also giving it this sort of random strategic nature. And that's all kind of complex, but essentially you can think about it like this. If you're playing D&D, what can you do? Well, if you're a mage, you can do a magical attack. If you're a rogue, you can sort of do a sneak attack. Right? You can also dodge or shield yourself with magic. And in typical D&D or Pathfinder, most of these abilities, as long as you have spell slots, are available to you at any point. It's just up to you what you do. However, in this game, kind of the whole concept is that you're not controlling a single character, you're controlling the party. And so, to sort of cut to the chase, what I ended up designing was a system where there are 5 decks. 4 for you, 1 for each one of your characters, and then 1 deck for the enemy. And every time there's a new turn, a new card will be randomly pulled from the deck for each one of your characters. And so you'll have 4 cards to choose from, and you can only choose 2 each turn. And essentially every time you use that card, it's shuffled back in the deck, and your next turn, you're pulling 4 new cards. So every turn, you'll essentially have to look at the cards that you've pulled from the abilities that each one of your characters has, and decide which ones to use in that instance. And then once your turn's over, you've played your 2 cards, the enemy is going to do a similar thing where they pull 2 random cards from their deck. And that's the baseline. There was also a lot of building on top of this that we'll get to in a moment, such as buffs, debuffs, things like that. And this all sort of ties into how the progression system works. So you have these cards that you can use and you randomly pull each turn. Well, as you add new points into each one of your skills, these skills are tied to each one of the characters. You've got intelligence, cunning, strength, charm, and luck. And if you choose a skill that corresponds with a character, such as strength for Mogert or intelligence for Tiriana, then you'll unlock a corresponding card for that character. Luck is the only one that does not unlock a card. However, a lot of your debuffs and your buffs and your status conditions are affected by the luck stat. So it's still one that you want to make sure you're putting points into. Okay, and just to get a little bit technical, there's also all of these debuffs and buffs and status conditions that you can put onto enemies and that can be put onto yourself. And these also stack. So you've got like attack up, which will raise the damage that you do, but the enemy might also have defense down, which means you'll do additional damage for that too. There's also status conditions like poisoned, burning, freezing, as well as a couple special ones like dodging, warding, and payback, which essentially just deals damage back to the enemy if they dealt damage to you on their turn, or vice versa, because all of these things are applicable for the enemy and for you. And sort of the final piece of the puzzle here is damage types. Pretty much every attack has a type of damage that it deals, and every enemy has a special weakness that if you hit them with that type of damage, you'll essentially do critical damage, which is essentially equivalent to a random number between 1 and your luck score. So there's also some typing to consider here as well. Okay, and that's the combat system. I could go more in depth. I could do a video breaking down the specifics of all of this. If you're interested, comment down below. Please let me know if that's something you're interested in. I could talk about this for probably 2 hours. It's that in depth, but let's go back to the devlog. Okay, and now with this combat screen looking good, I could not deal with just having this blank backdrop. And so it was time to start doing some level design for the exploration side of things. So first up, I threw some grass down. Simple enough, already looked better. Then I fiddled around a little bit, slapped some textures on other things, and created different layers of terrain textures for the ground so that it's not all uniform. Okay, so now we had some ground. The next thing I wanted to make was some fence posts, and this was important because this was the first step towards sort of outlining what the entire level design would look like, what the aesthetic of everything was going to be. Okay, fence posts, check. The next asset I needed to make was a tree. Just a basic tree to kind of fill out the landscape a little bit. And I tried a couple different styles for the textures for the leaves, and I ended up finding a style that I liked. And so now I had a couple basic 3D assets. A big part of the level design aesthetic I was going for was a mix of 2D and 3D assets, while still trying to make everything feel like things that could reasonably have been created, like, say, with a 3D printer, or just printed on a paper and put onto a playmat for, like, a role-playing game. So I made these bushes, and they kind of have a flap folded behind them, and if you walk over them, they fold down, and then they pop back up after you've walked, like, off of them. And that's to kind of emphasize this feeling you're supposed to have of just, this is you imagining what moving your little character across the board, like, represents. And so I did bushes, and then I did mushrooms, and sort of scattered them around in different colors. And then I had some basic level design, just to kind of get the vibe of what it's supposed to feel like. Okay, and then we switch again from level design back to mechanics. So now that this combat screen was set up, you needed a way to instigate that. So I wanted to make sure that all characters had a way to attack, to hit. And that would essentially transition you over to combat. So I started with Mogert, I gave him an animation, and then I created a little ball that would attach to his arm and his weapon that would represent where he was attacking when he swung his weapon. So sort of like a hitboxer's attack, or like a hit ball. It also needed to activate and deactivate depending on whether or not he was actually attacking. That way he wouldn't just get someone too close to his arm and automatically count that as an attack. So I set that up for him, and then you can also see that I set up a hitbox for the enemy. And I tested that out to mixed results. Kind of did this weird thing where he kept spinning. But then I set up an animation and I got all this figured out. So now when you hit enemies, they would react. And eventually it would switch so you'd go into combat. Next, I wanted to make coins that you could collect, so I used a 3D model that I used for my previous game, Toby's Topsy Tail, and just reworked the texture for it so that it fit this game better. I gave it an animation so it spins, and I made it so that when you collect it, when you walk over it, it's supposed to pop up and then like drop down to like give the assumption that it like popped into your inventory. Over that, it didn't exactly work the first time I tried it. Turns out I forgot to turn the loop off. So it kind of just keeps doing that. So with that loop off, then all you have to do is it does the one cycle, and then you set it to deactivate itself. Next up, I added in some grass to kind of just try that out and see how it would look, if it would fit the vibe. And I thought it worked well. I was going to need some tweaking later on, but I think the grass really helped fill things in quite a bit. After that, I switched back over to make the attack for the cat. And since, like Mogert, he's pretty much just swinging a weapon, it doesn't have to be too complex. And it's essentially set up the same exact way. I know I've mentioned this in other videos, but if it seems like I'm jumping around from one thing and then back to the other thing, back and forth a lot, that's part of my process. And I always recommend that if you're struggling with something, or if you've been doing one part of a project too long, and you're getting overwhelmed, it's better to just switch and then come back later. Too many people get locked down trying to complete one big thing, and that makes them lose focus, and then they just stop. So I did one of the attack animations, and I switched to something else, and then I came back. And that's better for the way my brain works. Might not be for you, but if you find yourself struggling, that's a tip I'll give. Next, I set up the attack for Sumbad, the bard, who's the bird, and his attack is a little bit different than the cat or the dog because his is magical in nature. So I animated him just screaming, essentially, just shouting, but the real attack is more of a magical sort of shriek. And then I put in a particle system to simulate the effect of you doing this magical shout. Okay, and then finally we have Tiriana, who also has a magical attack, but hers works a little bit differently. So clearly she's surrounded in a ball. That is her area of effect for her spells. She has a trade-off that the other characters don't have. They can only attack directly in front of them in the direction they're facing. When Tiriana attacks, it affects everything in a bubble around her, because she's casting large spells. This is also a way to balance the fact that she is by far the slowest character. Her walking speed and her mobility are reduced. However, her attack radius is much superior to the other characters. Additionally, every time she attacks, it's a different spell that she's casting around her, randomly selected from a pool of a few different spells she can cast. Okay, so this video is already past 10 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to show you everything that I've done since the last devlog. But if this is interesting to you, you like the project, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel, otherwise you probably won't get updates about it. I also make a lot of videos to help game devs directly, so subscribe for that as well. And if you are an indie game dev, I also have a Discord you can join. I'll link to that down in the description. That's a great way to stay a part of a community, to share your work, or just interact with me directly. Another good way to communicate with me would be to comment down below. I'm still a growing channel, and that type of stuff means the world to me. So, thank you for watching. I'm 3 Gnomes Games, and your tip for the end of this video is if you're starting to feel stuck, you're not feeling motivated to work on your indie game, then think about something you've always thought, oh, it would be cool if my game did this. Watch a tutorial for it on YouTube, because I guarantee there is one, and you might find out that that's maybe a little bit easier to wrap your head around than you thought. That's helped me get out of a few ruts. Thank you for watching.